In both the wine world and the art world, there is this magnetic passion that drew me in. It was this all-consuming passion that people had for something that I did not understand. And something about their obsession nudged me into a place where I really had a sort of identity crisis, where I felt like I might be living my life all wrong. Art didn't make sense to me. Wine didn't make sense to me. I'd never met a group of people willing to sacrifice so much for something of so little obvious practical value.
Than the art world people. So are you saying they're more obsessive than the wine world people?
I think it's so hard to compare. I mean, it's sort of like you're taking an Olympic swimmer and Olympic runner and being like, which is faster? It's like they're both really fast, just in different modes. They're both utterly fascinating.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 285. Why are some people with obsessive natures often drawn to both wine and art? How does strategic snobbery create deliberate barriers to entry in the art and wine worlds? And what does it mean to stay in the work or stay with the wine? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Bianca Bosker, author of the New York Times best-selling books, Get the Picture, A Mind-Bending Journey Among the Inspired Artists and Obsessive Art Fiends Who Taught Me How to See, and Cork Dork, a wine-fueled adventure among the obsessive sommeliers, big bottle hunters, and rogue scientists who taught me to live for taste. 3 of you are going to win a copy of Bianca's terrific new book, Get the Picture. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know that you'd like to win a copy. I'll choose 3 people randomly from those who contact me. I also still have 2 copies from last week's guest, Barbara Scott Goodman, her book, Wine Bites, on wine and food pairing with recipes to give away. Again, just email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. If you haven't won a book yet, now is your chance. And keep listening, as my goal is to offer lots more books and other prizes with every episode. You can qualify no matter where you live. Speaking of books, I've just started recording the audio version of Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. I'm working with Tantor Media, one of the largest producers of audiobooks in the US and the world. It wasn't guaranteed that I would get to narrate the book, as they often hire actors or professional narrators, so I had to audition. Fortunately, they're giving me the chance to do this. When I recorded my first book, Red, White, and Drunk All Over, I went into a local studio for 2 hours at a time, which I found grueling. You may not think of constantly talking for 2 hours as difficult, but once you get past 30 minutes, your mouth and throat start going dry. It becomes easier to lose focus and to start mispronouncing words or stumbling over them. Ask my beautiful, wonderful, patient podcast editor, Alex, about this. Thank you, Alex. Professional voice actors and narrators have the vocal athleticism to record for 6 to 8 hours in a stretch. Oh, hats off, glasses up to them. Wow. However, because Wine Witch is such a personal story, I wanted to be the one to tell it. Or I guess I should say speak it. I know where to infuse emotion. Oh, no. And what's meant to be funny, whether it is or not, is another story. Recording this book is much more humane since I'm able to do it where I record this podcast in my home office. So my daily routine is to record for about an hour each morning to keep my voice fresh and my energy high. I have until the end of May to complete it, so fingers crossed the sessions will continue to go well. I'll share more behind-the-scenes updates next week. Speaking of Wine Witch, have you read the paperback or ebook? If yes, well then have you bought a copy for a friend or family member? Please do if you'd like to support this podcast that I do for you on a volunteer basis to ensure it continues. You can order it for yourself or someone else from any online book retailer now, no matter where you live. It usually arrives in a day or two, and of course, the ebook is instant. It's a fast read. Every little bit helps spread the message in this book of hope, justice, and resilience. You can send a copy directly to a friend or family member via the online retailer and make their day when a gift arrives in the mail rather than another bill. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/285. I also offer a free companion guide that has book club and wine group discussion questions that can also spark a conversation between two friends or a partner or spouse. It asks questions such as how you feel about your own relationship with wine, especially post-pandemic, marketing tactics towards women and men and how they differ, and whether social media is still a good place to connect with others, among lots of other questions. The guide also has wine recommendations, pairings, and tips for organizing your own informal wine tasting, and you can get it at winewitchonfire.com. If you've read the book or are reading it, I'd love to hear from you. If your book club or wine group plans to read it, let me know if you'd like me to join in via Zoom. I also have a summary sheet that you can send to your book club wine group members who are deciding on upcoming books. Pick me, pick me. Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. Okay, on with the show. Bianca Bosker is the author of the New York Times best-selling books, Get the Picture, A Mind-Bending Journey Among the Inspired Artists and Obsessive Art Fiends Who Taught Me How to See, and Cork Dork, A Wine-Fueled Adventure Among the Obsessive Sommeliers, Big Bottle Hunters, and Rogue Scientists Who Taught Me How to Live for Taste. A contributing writer to The Atlantic, she has also written for publications such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal. Her work has been recognized with awards from the New York Press Club, the Society of Professional Journalists, and others, and has been included in the Best American Travel Writing. And she joins us now from New York City. Welcome, Bianca. It's so great to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, absolutely. And we spoke 5 years ago for Cork Dork, so I'm really interested in this latest book. And although it's not about wine, we are going to lasso it right back to wine anyway.
Fantastic.
So congratulations on hitting the New York Times bestseller list again with this book. That is amazing and so well-deserved. You're on book tour now. How many cities have you visited and how many more to go?
Ooh, that's a good question. How many have I been to now? I mean, I guess 10, a dozen, I'm not sure. But it's been a blast. Yeah, I've been everywhere from Portland, Oregon, my hometown, where I was at Powell's Books, which I think of as one of my parents. Houston, Austin, Miami, obviously New York City. I'll be heading to DC in a couple weeks. So, just kind of keeping the party going as much as possible.
Well, let's hope a Canadian city might get added to that tour, given the success of the book.
I hope so too.
Please let us know. We'll be there. What are the top 3 things you found most effective in marketing this book? Of course, I am asking for a friend.
I think that with book marketing, it's sort of amazing to me how much it continues to be a little bit of a black box. Like, I have been asking everyone I can get a hold of that same question. And I think the answer I basically get is like, you just have to try everything and do everything. I mean, I can tell you that I am someone who says yes to everything. I feel like someone once told me you sell one copy at a time. And so if anyone gives me the opportunity or is interested in hearing about the book where I'm doing, yes, like I will be there. I will be at your book club. I will be on your podcast. I will, be on your Substack, like whatever it is. I really am so excited about those opportunities and really grateful for them. I mean, I will tell you, as you probably know, and I think a lot of people know, like I've basically emailed everybody that I know about the book.
You have to.
Yeah, I want you to know. I care. I'm excited. I genuinely believe that people's lives will be worse off if they don't read it. And I also feel like a lot of us, we get daily emails from, I don't know, Open Table or food delivery services. Like, I can send you 2 emails about a project that's taken years of my life. So hopefully people aren't too annoyed, but that's been sort of my philosophy.
Agree 100%. And how many book clubs have you zoomed into approximately? Do you know?
I don't know, but I always try my best, if the schedules permit. I'm supposed to go to my neighbors next week. So,
Hmm. There you go.
yeah.
Even neighbors count. Yeah, absolutely. I'm zooming into one tonight, but yeah, book clubs are an amazing way. Okay, we'll get back to the topic here now that I've had my free consulting moment. So thank you for that. Now, you say that it's the people in the art world who drew you to this story. And I love how you described one artist as, quote, hissing at the poor quality grommets at a competing gallery that they were using to hang their paintings. It's so telling, just that, even that one word. Obsessive is in the subtitle of both your books. Do you find art world people more obsessive or less than wine world people? Why? Why not?
Yeah, so you're totally right to hop on that through line. I mean, I think as I write in Cork Dork, like I am someone obsessed with obsession. And I think in both worlds, in the wine world and the art world, there is this just magnetic passion that drew me in. And I think in particular, in both cases, it was this all consuming passion that people had for something that I did not understand. And something about their obsession nudged me into a place where I really had a sort of identity crisis where I felt like, I think I might be living my life all wrong. Art didn't make sense to me, wine didn't make sense to me. And that disconnect between what I was observing and my own sort of inability to figure out why these things were such big deals to people really launched me on these journeys to understand these worlds. And so, I think that in art's case, art had been a passion of mine growing up, but by the time I kind of got to be in my 30s, we were not on speaking terms. I think for most of my adult life, I felt like I didn't know how to do art. And as you said, the art itself was very befuddling to me. And even as I tried reconnecting, really left me cold. But it was the intensity of the people within it that intrigued me. I'd never met a group of people willing to sacrifice so much for something of so little obvious practical value.
Than the art world people. So are you saying they're more obsessive than the wine world people?
I think it's so hard to compare. I mean, it's sort of like you're taking an Olympic swimmer, an Olympic runner, and being like, which is faster? It's like they're both really fast, just in different modes, So I just think that both of them have this, to me, really magnetic obsession, but it's sort of hard to quantify, like, which is more intense. They're both, to me, utterly fascinating and personally, we're all consuming.
Now, I know you're not a psychoanalyst, but why do you think obsessive natures are drawn to these two worlds?
I love that question. I think it's a really, really interesting one. I mean, I think, perhaps part of it is these are worlds where people are not necessarily in general like in it for the money, right? I mean, I think there has to be something else that's pulling you through it. I also think these are both worlds where you can go deep. Like there's kind of an endless amount of information that you can learn. I also think that these are worlds that are not purely sort of bloodless intellectual pursuits. They are both in their own way hedonistic, right? They really sort of involve all of us. They involve our minds and they involve our bodies. And that was something that took me a while to arrive at with the art world. I think that for the last 100 years or so, we've been told that what really matters about an artwork is the idea behind it, like the thought trumps the thing. And Marcel Duchamp sort of arguably kicked us off on that path when he took a urinal, was credited with taking a urinal, putting it on a pedestal and telling us that it was art. And he was a big proponent for the idea of art that tickled the mind, but not necessarily the eye. He sort of was dismissive of what he termed retinal art, which was kind of included the whole band of Impressionism. But, I think when we go to a lot of galleries and museums, there's a lot of hushed murmuring about, dead philosophers and ideas and dichotomies and liminal this, liminal that. And what was so fascinating to me and such a breakthrough for me in my relationship with art was actually getting into artist studios and realizing the way that art making is a deeply physical process, right? It is almost a blood sport in the way that wine is too, right?
Well, you're stretching canvases and
Totally. And I think for me, it was a lesson in the way that artists look in art. And one artist I worked for, Julie Curtis, as she put it, an idea is not a painting. Painting is constant decision making. And I think working for artists was for me this revolution in the way I saw art, but also in the way I saw the world. And part of what it taught me when it came to art was to slow down, to look at the physical form of the work, and to examine the decisions that an artist makes. And I think that can lead us to having a really heady experience. But the experience of looking at art, I think, is really almost like, being with another person. You're two bodies in space. And there's a totally different connection that you have when you just let yourself have this physical experience and recognize that, like being around people, it's totally different to be face to face with an artwork than it is to, see it remotely or digitally.
On the internet, yeah. And you say it's a series of decisions again, because I'm going to keep bringing it back. But winemaking, too, is a series of decisions, as is wine tasting. I mean, there's just so much that goes into it. Which grapes are we going to plant? What's the orientation? Southeast exposure, which barrels? How long are we going to let them hang on the vines, and so on? It is like a multitude of decisions. I just see so much in that. You were kind of getting to it there, but you have a wonderful phrase that says, stay in the work, like slow down, absorb it. I mean, it's what I teach my online wine and food pairing students. The difference between tasting and drinking is spitting and thinking. Stay with it. Think about what you're experiencing, what you're tasting. It is subjective, but I think you can put some analysis to it. What do you mean by stay in the work?
In the work, yeah, stay in the work. No, that's exactly it. Yeah. Well, I mean, to back up a bit, I think when I was training as a sommelier for the journey that became Cork Dork, I was doing a lot of blind tasting. And when you're blind tasting, you have this glass of wine and you have to figure out what grape it was made with, where in the world it was made, when it was made. And you really have to do that based solely on that thing in front of you. And, I think that process for me was really a lesson in staying true to your own felt experience of something. Like there's so much that's designed to play to our sensory biases. But when you're blind tasting, when you're like mano a mano with that glass of wine, you have to dismiss things like price or that little voice in your head that's like, don't miss, could it be Chardonnay? You always miss Chardonnay. All that stuff is not helpful. And what was really off-putting and surprising to me as I embarked on this journey into the art world was it couldn't have been more different. Like the philosophy on bonding with an artwork couldn't have been more opposite to that. This journey for me into the art world was really about developing what artists call visual literacy. It's about developing an eye. For me, it was about, how could I not just stare in an artwork's direction, but really see it, have a conversation with it. And as I was trying to develop my eye, I realized that so many of these art experts spent surprisingly little time discussing the merits of the artworks themselves. And instead, they ask questions like, where did the artist go to school? Who else owns the work? What gallery has shown it? Who are they sleeping with? All of that information in the art world is referred to as context. Context is like the web of names around an artist, the sort of social cachet. And so it felt, like I said, this real kind of culture shock for me. I felt like the wine world had encouraged me to, again, really stay present in that experience and dismiss all those things that are designed to play to our biases. Whereas the art world was like, no. What you are experiencing person to person with an artwork isn't so important compared to context. And context really seemed to shape art connoisseurs' opinion of the work even more than the thing itself. And I will say that emphasis on context didn't sit well with me. I think it felt like I was being encouraged to outsource my eye to the hive mind. And it also felt like one more way to exclude people from the art world, because I think these connoisseurs become so much more important if we're told that we need years of going to art fairs, vast familiarity with artists' biographies, an advanced degree, and so on and so forth to commune with a painting.
Well, it's similar to in wine in that some buyers rely on scores or the latest prices at auctions, and that's how they stock their cellars rather than what do I actually like to drink?
Totally. And so I think stay in the work for me was kind of advice that I arrived at as I started working at other galleries, getting deeper into the world, spending more time with artists. And I think that, artists do have this ability to stay in the work. And I think one advice that I got from an artist that I found very helpful and yet obviously simple was she told me to, when you see an artwork, just try and notice 5 things about it. And those don't have to be grandiose. It does not have to be, this is a meditation on social hierarchies and class relations in the years following the French Revolution. It could just be like, this pink makes me want to lick it, or like, this hand will not let me look away. And I guess if I could try and extrapolate maybe some similarities with wine tasting, is that it's just noticing, but it's also kind of putting language on that experience. And I think that noticing those 5 things is a pathway into the piece, much in the way that part of that process of noticing means, like I said before, paying attention to the artist's decisions. And yeah, I think that perhaps similarly with blind tasting, a real breakthrough I had in that case was just learning to put names on smells. We smell a lot of odors. Most of us do not have a lot of experience or comfort actually putting language on those smells. And that's absolutely crucial, as you know, for wine tasting.
Excellent. Absolutely. To be able to discuss it, to name something is to, well, not have power over it, but at least a familiarity. And someone said, I can't remember, but the extent of my language is the extent of my understanding of the world, or something. The limits of my language limits my world. I forget what it was, but I do believe that, words have power and naming things and so on. But there's also, of course, geek speak in both worlds. You call it international art speak, and then there's wine geek speak. And the strategic snobbery, as you describe, I love that, for keeping people in and out with these code words. Do you think, though, that that language, once we start describing things, can be also very reductive?
Yeah, art speak is, I think, part of an arsenal of tools that I began to realize was part of, like I said, the strategic snobbery. So it's the very deliberate barriers to entry that existed to keep out the quote unquote Joe Schmoes, which was one gallerist's term for general public. Cork Talk really convinced me in the value of learning by doing. And so just to give readers context or listeners context, as part of my journey into the art world, I was really determined to get inside and get in the middle of the action and actually go and work in the art world. And so that kicked off this 5-year journey, and that involved me, selling art at galleries, working in artist studios, guarding museum wings as a security guard, embedding with collectors and curators, all of part of this journey to understand, like, why does art matter and how do we engage with it more deeply? And speaking of deliberate barriers to entry, at the outset, I was really just surprised by how hard it was to get access. Like, people did not want to talk to me. They did not respond by emails. They gave me threats, warnings. They were like, do not follow through on this plan if you want to keep living in New York City. And then once I got further in and actually started working as a gallery and an assistant, I began to understand that, yes, the language is sort of one of these techniques and one of these constructions, I guess I would say, that exists to sort of distinguish you as someone that does or does not get it. I think, obviously, I write about tasting notes in Cork Talk. I was very interested as a writer, especially in the whole language around wine. And I think that I'm a bit more forgiving, I think, I have my own issues with tasting notes. I think a lot of tasting notes have sort of spiraled out into the universe. And yet, I think that there was a period of time in wine where there was an effort to rein that in. And so a lot of really the origins of the tasting notes that we use to describe wine was an effort to actually bring that language back down to earth and encourage us to use a shared vocabulary where we would talk about wines not in terms of being masculine or feminine or holding to the blood of their class, but instead, smelling like white flowers, smelling like orange peel, apple. I mean, things that any of us could find in a supermarket and sort of train ourselves on. And so I think that there's some of that language can become ridiculous, but I think that there's something admirable about the spirit of how do we come up with a shared vocabulary? How do we come up with a shared alphabet? And so I think art speak bothers me because I think it exists not for clear communication. Like, there's a study of press releases in the art world that found that the words spatial and non-spatial get used interchangeably. If you're not familiar with art speak, it's basically this idea that the bigger the word, the longer the sentence, the better. I mean, these days, to sound like you know something about art, the trick is basically to sound like a French professor who's been the victim of a terrible translation job.
I must share with you your own sentence that, I'll get it wrong if I can't find it in my notes, but one of my favorite things that you said was people in the art world sound like
they were trapped in dictionaries and being forced to chew their way out. Yeah.
I love that. Oh my God, that is so good and so evocative.
I was told when I was working out, I was like, you don't say a work is sold, it's placed. I mean, it's not a website, it's an online viewing room.
And what are indexical markings?
Yeah, indexical marks of the artist's body. Yes, ours would be finger painting to the rest
Finger
of
paint.
us. Yeah. So
Great.
I think that there's certainly times where there's, I think, an overly complex terminology in the wine world. And yet I think there are times where I forgive it at times because I think the specificity of language allows us to be sure that we are talking about the same things. The idea of describing the rotundone smells of a wine, I think as long as you're using it in a accurate way as opposed to just trying to sound fancy.
What is even that? This Arctic?
The compound that exists in black pepper, for example, but can also exist in Syrah grapes. And so there's a certain logic for saying, sort of helps explain why we describe black pepper Syrahs as often smelling like black pepper, because they can actually have a similar chemical compound as black pepper.
Wow, it reminds me of petrichor, that smell right before a rainstorm.
Yes, which I love. Although petrichor is, yes, not less scientific, but so beautiful. I was thinking about this morning when I walked out after a rainstorm, and I was like, love it. What's better than petrichor, my friend?
Yeah. For the airwar. Okay, sorry. Go back to what you were saying about the art speak. You find it more exclusionary.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think I was doing a radio interview and someone actually called in and mounted a defense of art speak, which I'd never heard before. And they're like, every field has their own vocabulary. And I think, yes, but do we really think that legalese is doing the world any good? And doctors I would excuse, because I was like, I want my physician to be very specific about the organ that they are removing, right? Or like, yes. I'm willing to forget that.
It's spatially around your spleen.
Yeah, I think you need some technical terms to be sure that, we're very clear on what exactly is going on, what we're diagnosing. But I mean, I think that it feels alienating. I find it alienating, at least. I mean, I find that oftentimes, I ended up, as I said, working as a security guard at an art museum, and I spent a lot of time reading the wall text, the sort of paragraph-long explanation that exists, next to a lot of artworks. And I felt like I was the world's hardest reading comprehension exam. I spent hours reading some of these labels, and I still don't know what they said. And I think that part of that also led to me kind of disowning them as a tool that was necessary for looking at art. I mean, I used to go to galleries and museums, and I felt like it was downright rude when they didn't have a wall label for each work. I was like, how am I supposed to know what I'm looking at unless you explain it to me using words? And as I began to work as a guard, I actually got to the point where I was standing in front of the wall labels so people couldn't read them. I was that asshole because I felt like they limited people's interpretations. I think people could come at pieces, to me, very confusing and very ungenerous, as art critics would say. And even though they didn't know the artist or hadn't seen the piece before, if they let themselves, would have these incredible journeys with the work. I loved standing with visitors and challenging them. I was like, what do you see in this piece? And we would travel the world, and we travel through space and time, standing in front of these pieces when they let themselves go to those places. And I think wall text, is written in a language that's needlessly dense, but can also suggest there's sort of one right answer to looking at an artwork, which is certainly not the case.
That's true. And there is some parallel there with blind tasting and not being influenced by the label. And then by extension, the price or the producer or whatever, just experiencing the wine for what it is and what it means to you, perhaps.
Absolutely. I have a very vivid memory of being at a blind tasting with a bunch of Psalms. And I remember one of them was like, I think it's Zinfandel, but I hate Zinfandel and I like this wine, So, and afterwards, when she learned it was actually Zinfandel, she was, wow, I might actually need to put this Zinfandel on the menu or on my list, right? And I just think that was, for me, just a moment that really stuck with me about the value of blind tasting in encouraging us to
lift our filters, as you say, about art as well, get away from reductionism and all the complacency, as you say. Yeah, I loved all the insights about art. I kept, of course, putting them back onto wine. But you say there's a suspicion in the art world of something that's pretty. Does that remind you at all of the sort of pendulum swing away from sort of, I don't know, pretty wines to the funky, foxy, sometimes flawed characters of natural wine as being a virtue, or even that barnyard smell that can come from Brettanomyces in Burgundy Pinot Noir?
I think that's a really interesting question to ask and an interesting parallel. I mean, I will say that I think that the art world is suspicious of beauty, and it's not just the art world. I think that a lot of sort of polite society, yeah, I just think that it goes beyond that. I think a lot of polite society has a real suspicion of beauty. And I think there's a sense that it's passé, that it is corrupting, that it's, sort of like falling for its charms is somehow the sign of moral weakness. And I think, is it because it's easy? I mean, I think the origins of this suspicion of beauty started about a century ago. After sort of the horrors of World War I, there was a sense that embracing beauty was frivolous. Like the world was too messed up. There were these bigger problems we had to deal with, and beauty was just sort of too frivolous of a concern for this crazy, disturbed moment. That art kind of should be, and other things should really be more philosophical. And so I think that what I will say is that it was very clear to me from the get-go that there was, I think, within circles of the art world, this tendency to treat beauty as the sworn enemy. And what I found as I got further in was that I think beauty is not optional. I think beauty is absolutely essential. And I think beauty, with art, we can begin to see beauty in so many more places than we did before. As you alluded to before, I mean, I think I sort of had these pair of breakthroughs. I think I had always saw as also something kind of a luxury. I mean, it can't, house you, feed you, or be used to kill predators. And I think with art, we hear so much about the sort of rarefied activities, these big prices, these big names. As I got further in, I began to realize I understand now why artists and scientists argue is a fundamental part of our humanity. And as you said before, I began to understand the ways that art plays this absolutely crucial function of helping us fight the reducing tendencies of our minds. I'm going to bring it back to beauty, but just to explain that idea for a second, when we look at the world, we do not see it like video cameras, right? We do not dispassionately, accurately record the scenes around us. Our brains are really these trash compactors. We evolved, to sort of oversimplify the world because we needed to be able to see like a lion moving in the bush to come out and get us. Unfortunately, that hasn't really changed. And so as we look out on the world, we have these filters of expectations that descend to sort of preemptively organize, sort, prioritize, dismiss all the raw data coming in even before we get the full picture. And I think what art can do, scientists and artists argue, is help us yank off those filters of expectation. A bit like dreams, right? Like they introduce a glitch. It's a glitch that is a gift, one that helps our minds jump the curb, sort of question its assumptions. I mean, vision is really a hallucination. So much of the reality that we experience is sort of our own construction and belief. And I think what art can do is help us remove those filters of expectation so we're seeing the world in a way that lets in more information, more nuance, and ultimately more beauty. And so when I say that art can help us discover beauty in places that we never did before, I think it can let us look with fresh eyes, with a fresh brain on the everyday. Like I love the way that artists were able to really see art in something as sort of quotidian as like a sewage treatment plant or a motorcycle. And I think what they have this ability to do is sort of look at the everyday with an art mindset, sort of look at something. I experienced this after working at the Guggenheim. I started sort of looking at everything from like a toothbrush to a hot dog cart like it was a sculpture. It was sort of with this extra beat, this willingness to linger on how did it get to be this way? And so I think for me, it led me to really open up my idea and definition of what beauty is. I think beauty does not have to be the kind of visual equivalent of a vanilla cupcake. To me, beauty is really just something that draws us closer to it, makes us curious, makes us want to linger with it, study it, examine it, be around it. It sort of nudges us into this place where we're wondering about the world and our place in it. And so to bring it back to wine, I mean, I think that perhaps there's something in which I think there's a lot of different things that bring people to funky wines. But I also think that perhaps what it might be is for some people that they're discovering a beauty in them that they didn't perhaps appreciate before, but that through sustained time with wines, with tasting, they're sort of opening themselves up to finding what they consider beauty in different places.
And a new taste experience. I mean, there's a whole range, as you know, with wine, so we can lift those filters too, from vanilla, Chardonnays, and Cabernets.
Yeah. I think that there was an artist, Julie Curtis, that I worked for who really encouraged me to think of taste less as a destination than as a journey. And I think that for me, I've always been of this mindset that I had to find the right tastes. I had to figure out what was good, what was bad. And I think a lot of us perhaps, share that idea, but also I think a lot of us wear our tastes as this sort of ironclad identity. It's like we are a person that likes natural wines. We are a person that only drinks California Chardonnays. We are a person who exclusively listens to country music. And I think that we oftentimes are very loath to question our tastes, to challenge our tastes. And I think I'm so grateful to Julie and to the other artists I met for really pushing me on that, for helping me understand that with new tastes comes a new self, and that taste, again, should be a journey. It should be an adventure. And part of developing our eye and being able to engage more deeply with art and really anything means exposing ourselves to different things we don't know, things we think we might not like, things that are just unfamiliar and weird to us. And I think that's exciting and can be destabilizing, but ultimately, I think, very rewarding.
Absolutely. And the whole thing about getting it right or wrong, when it comes to blind tasting, some people, the mark of a good taster is, did they guess the label correctly? And to me, that's beside the point for most tasters. Maybe in a Master of Wine or Master Sommelier exam, getting it right is extra points, but I don't think so much in life getting it right is or as opposed to getting it to be more expansive.
Or just getting more of it.
More of it. Yeah, especially the good wine. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Bianca. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, why are people with obsessive natures often drawn to both wine and art? Bianca observed an all-consuming passion and intensity in both worlds. As she says, I'd never met a group of people willing to sacrifice so much for something of so little obvious practical value. Perhaps part of it is that these worlds are where people are not necessarily in it for the money. There has to be something else that's pulling you through it. I also think, she continues, that these are worlds where you can go deep, like there's a kind of endless amount of information you can learn. And she thinks that these are worlds that are not purely bloodless intellectual pursuits. They are both, in their own way, hedonistic. They really do involve all of us, our minds and our bodies. I love that. Number 2, how does strategic snobbery create deliberate barriers to entry in the worlds of art and wine? Bianca explains that it exists to keep out the Joe Schmoes. She began to understand that language is one of those constructions that exists to distinguish you as someone who does or does not get it. She thinks a lot of tasting notes have spiraled out into the universe, I have to agree. The origins, though, of tasting notes, it was an effort to develop a shared vocabulary, and there is something admirable in the spirit of that. But she also thinks that art speak exists not for clear communication. And number 3, what does it mean to stay in the work or to stay with the wine? Bianca advises us to slow down, absorb it, both the art and the wine. It's also what I teach my online wine and food pairing students. As I say, the difference between tasting and drinking is spitting and thinking. Stay with it. Think about what you're experiencing and what you're tasting. And while it is subjective, I agree with Bianca that you can apply some analysis to better understand and appreciate both wine and art. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Bianca, links to her website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. You can also find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemclean.com/class. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/285. Email me if you have a sip tip question or would like to win one of 3 copies of Bianca's terrific new book, Get the picture. I also still have 2 copies of last week's guest, Barbara Goodman, her book, Wine Bites, on pairing wine and food with recipes to give away. And, of course, I'd love to hear from you if you've read my book or are in the process of reading it at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. If you missed episode 7, go back and take a listen. I chat with Bianca about her first book, Cork Dork, an insider look at the wine world. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
One of the things that was really a revelation is the fact that many of these high-end restaurants are really judging you even more than you're judging them. They're Googling you before you come in. They're keeping extensive logs on what you order, your pet peeves, personal preferences, your relationship to the restaurant, your dining history. If you spend a lot of money, you could be a wine PX, which is short for Personne Extraordinaire. If you're a temper tantrum, you might be an HWC, which is short for Handle with Care.
Oh.
Or SOE, which is Sense of Entitlement. On the surface, it can seem perhaps mercenary, but first of all, they are businesses. I mean, liquid keeps restaurants liquid.
Absolutely. And I've heard it said that the sommelier doesn't sell the bottle to the customer. The sommelier sells the customer to the customer. Not in a manipulative way, but I see you and I think this is you with the wine. And of course, the old adage is customers will eat you poor and drink you rich. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Bianca. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell one friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about the parallels and passions between the worlds of wine and art. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie MacLean Wine on their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that you feel is a work of art. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.